So let me tell you about the single greatest day of my adult life. The day I looked out my front window at 7:43 in the morning, coffee in hand, and watched Brenda Kowalski, HOA President, self-appointed neighborhood deity, and owner of the most aggressively symmetrical garden in the continental United States, stand at the end of my driveway with her clipboard, staring directly at my porch, at the man standing on it in a full black tuxedo with white gloves, and slowly, very slowly, lose her entire mind. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Let me take you to the beginning, because this story, like all truly great stories, starts with a man, his porch, and a woman who had entirely too much time on her hands. My name is Logan Mercer. I am 34 years old. I work in software development from home. I have a rescue dog named Biscuit, who is 12 pounds of pure chaos, and I live in Maplewood Estates, which sounds like a lovely, peaceful community of normal human beings, but is, in fact, a suburban war zone governed by a 42-page document called the Maplewood Estates Community Standards and Aesthetic Guidelines, Revised Edition, which I am fairly confident was written by someone who genuinely hates joy. I had lived in Maplewood Estates for 2 years before Brenda Kowalski first appeared at my door. 2 good years. Quiet years. Years during which I was blissfully unaware that my porch, my modest, perfectly functional 12 by 8 foot front porch, was apparently an eyesore of such magnitude that it threatened the entire social fabric of the neighborhood. Here is what was on my porch on the morning of the fateful first letter. One welcome mat that said, "Come back with a warrant," which I thought was charming. One rocking chair. One small side table with a coffee mug on it that I had forgotten to bring inside. One potted fern, a living plant, full of life and photosynthesis and biological optimism. One package that had been delivered the day before that I hadn't opened yet. And Biscuit's water bowl, because Biscuit likes to sit outside with me in the mornings. That was it. That was the full inventory. A chair, a table, a forgotten mug, a fern, a package, and a dog bowl. Brenda apparently looked at this collection of ordinary human objects and saw the fall of Western civilization. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, cream-colored paper, then the Maplewood Estates logo at the top, a little oak tree that always looks vaguely judgmental, and it read, in part, "Dear Mr. Mercer, it has come to the attention of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association that your front porch is currently in a state of disarray inconsistent with the community's aesthetic standards, as outlined in Section 7, Subsection C, Paragraph 4 of the Community Guidelines. Items observed include unauthorized outdoor furniture placement, unsecured personal items, plant materials of unclear horticultural classification, and what appears to be an unattended delivery receptacle. You are hereby requested to bring your porch into compliance within 14 days or face a formal review and potential fine of up to $150. Signed, Brenda Kowalski, HOA President, Maplewood Estates Community Board. I read this letter 3 times. I want you to understand that each reading made it somehow worse. By the 3rd reading, I had arrived at plant materials of unclear horticultural classification. And I had to set the letter down and go stare at my fern for a full minute. It's a fern, Brenda. It's a fern. It grows in dirt and asks for nothing. It has never wronged anyone. It is, genuinely, one of the least threatening organisms on Earth, and you have referred to it in official documentation as plant materials of unclear horticultural classification. I brought the mug inside. I brought the package inside. I moved Biscuit's water bowl to the side. I left the fern, because I refuse, on principle, to be intimidated by a Brenda, and I figured that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one informed me that while some progress had been noted, my porch still failed to meet community standards due to the presence of outdoor furniture of non-uniform style, the rocking chair, and vegetation placed in a manner inconsistent with the neighborhood's landscaping aesthetic. The fern, again. Brenda was personally offended by my fern. I was beginning to think this was less about community standards and more about one woman's deeply personal vendetta against plant life. This letter also included, helpfully, a pamphlet. Creating a Beautiful HOA-Compliant Porch, a Guide for Homeowners. I opened it. It contained photographs of porches so bare, so aggressively neutral, so completely devoid of personality that I actually felt a little sad. These were porches that had given up. These were porches that had been defeated. Not my porch. My porch still had its rocking chair and its fern and its dignity. I responded to the second letter with a polite but firm note explaining that a rocking chair and a potted fern were, by any reasonable definition, appropriate porch items, and that I would be happy to review the specific guidelines they were citing. I included a citation from a gardening website confirming that ferns are, in fact, a real plant with a real Latin name, and therefore presumably qualified as legitimate horticultural material. The HOA's response to my response was a third letter, which informed me that my porch was still in violation and escalated my case to the Formal Review Committee, a body that, as far as I could tell, consisted entirely of Brenda and whoever she could drag to a Wednesday evening meeting at the community center. That was the moment I decided this required a different approach. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I am not, by nature, a petty person. I am reasonable. I am measured. I believe in communication and compromise and the peaceful resolution of disputes. I have, on multiple occasions, apologized when I was wrong. I returned a library book once, 8 years overdue, with a handwritten apology note. I am fundamentally a decent human being. But there is something about being sent 3 official letters on cream-colored HOA letterhead about a fern, that activates a part of the brain that is not interested in being reasonable. A part of the brain that instead whispers, what if? Instead of bringing the fern inside, you made the porch so aggressively, so magnificently, so performatively correct that the HOA had absolutely nothing to complain about while simultaneously making Brenda Kowalski question every decision she had ever made in her life. That is the part of the brain I listened to, and that is how I ended up calling Jeffrey. Jeffrey, full name Jeffrey Harrington, and he absolutely insisted on spelling it with a G, was a retired hospitality professional. He had spent 30 years working in high-end hotels and private clubs. He had, at various points in his career, served as a concierge at a 4-star hotel in Edinburgh, a front-of-house manager at a private members club in London, and, most recently, a household manager for a fairly wealthy family in Connecticut who had moved to Dubai and left Jeffrey professionally adrift in the American suburbs, which he described as a challenging environment for a man of my particular skill set. I found Jeffrey through a local community board. He had posted a brief, dignified notice. Experienced household professional seeks part-time engagement. References available upon request. Minimum 4 hours per day preferred. I called him. We spoke for 45 minutes. He was, somehow, exactly what I was looking for. Jeffrey, I said, I need someone to stand on my front porch in a tuxedo every morning, ideally between 7 and 9 a.m., and simply be present. Look composed. Look professional. Manage the porch. Ensure everything is in perfect order. Be, essentially, the most impeccably presented person anyone in this neighborhood has ever encountered on a residential porch. There was a brief pause on the phone. Then Jeffrey said, I see. And what would be the objective? My HOA thinks my porch is messy, I said. I would like to demonstrate in the most spectacular way possible that my porch is not merely not messy, but is in fact being actively managed by a professional. Another pause. I could hear Jeffrey processing this. And then he said, with the dignified calm of a man who had seen genuinely strange things in 30 years of hospitality, I believe I can be of service. We negotiated terms. Jeffrey would arrive at my house at 6:45 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday, dressed in his full professional attire. Black tuxedo jacket, white shirt, black bow tie, white cotton gloves. The works. He would stand on the porch, maintain the appearance of the porch in perfect condition, greet any passers-by with appropriate professional courtesy, and handle any inquiries with what he called the standard level of dignified deflection. I would pay him a fair hourly rate, plus a small, unusual circumstances supplement, which he named with complete seriousness, and I agreed to without question, because Jeffrey was clearly worth every penny. On his first morning, Jeffrey arrived at 6:44 a.m., which I found deeply impressive given that I had asked for 6:45. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like it had been made for him, which, I later learned, it had been. He had brought, entirely on his own initiative, a small silver tray, a pair of reading glasses, and a leather-bound notebook that he referred to as his porch log. I watched from inside as he walked up my porch steps, surveyed the scene with the careful eye of a man assessing a dining room before service, made two minor adjustments, the angle of the rocking chair, the centering of the welcome mat, and then stood, hands clasped behind his back, at perfect parade rest, looking out at Maplewood Estates with the serene confidence of someone who had absolutely nowhere else to be, and was completely fine with that. I felt, and I am not embarrassed to admit this, an emotion that I can only describe as pride. The effect on the neighborhood was immediate. Margaret Chen from number 14 walked her dog past my house at 7:15 a.m. and did a full stop, mouth slightly open, staring at Jeffrey. Jeffrey inclined his head politely. "Good morning, madam." Margaret looked at me, through the window. I waved. She walked on, now walking her dog in the slightly stunned, mechanical way of someone who has witnessed something they don't have a category for. Dave Kowalski, yes, Brenda's husband, who I had always found to be a perfectly reasonable person trapped in an unreasonable marriage, jogged past at 7:30 a.m. on his morning run, saw Jeffrey, stopped completely, took out his earbuds, looked at the porch, looked at Jeffrey, looked at the porch again, and then jogged on without a word, but with the expression of a man who had just added something new to his list of things not to ask his wife about. And at 7:43 a.m., right on schedule, Brenda Kowalski came around the corner. I had been waiting for this. I had my coffee. I was positioned at the front window like a general watching the battlefield from a safe vantage point. I saw her before she saw Jeffrey. She was walking with purpose, clipboard in hand, the way she always walked when she was doing what she called the morning survey, which was a thing she actually did, walking the neighborhood looking for violations, which should tell you everything you need to know about how Brenda spent her mornings. She turned onto my block. She was already looking at my house, already reaching for her pen, already composing the fourth letter in her head. And then she saw Jeffrey. She stopped. Not a polite stop. Not a, "oh, interesting, let me assess this" stop. A full, total, feet-planted stop, like a cartoon character who has run off a cliff and not yet looked down. Her clipboard arm dropped to her side. Tantuant. Her pen hovered in the air, forgotten. Jeffrey, who had seen her coming, inclined his head at precisely the same angle he had used for Margaret Chen. "Good morning, madam." Brenda stared at him. "A lovely morning in Maplewood Estates," Jeffrey continued, in the tone of someone who genuinely means it. "Mild temperature, light cloud cover. The birch on the corner appears to be coming into bud." Brenda looked at the porch. It was, objectively, immaculate. Jeffrey had spent the morning maintaining it to a standard that honestly put the rest of the neighborhood to shame. The rocking chair was positioned at an optimal angle. The welcome mat was centered to within a fraction of an inch. The fern, the beautiful, magnificent, deeply legitimate fern, was freshly misted and frankly glowing with health. Positioned on a small wooden stand that Jeffrey had sourced from somewhere and added without being asked. The porch surface had been swept. There was a small, tasteful ceramic planter in one corner that Jeffrey had apparently brought as what he called a professional enhancement, which I had not known about until I saw it, and which looked extremely correct. "What," said Brenda, "is this?" "I'm sorry?" said Jeffrey. "What is this?" She gestured at Jeffrey with her clipboard. "What are you doing on this porch?" "My job," said Jeffrey pleasantly. "Can I help you with something?" "Who are you?" "My name is Jeffrey, madam. I'm the porch manager." There was a silence during which I believe Brenda's brain was rebooting. "The porch manager?" she repeated. "Correct," said Jeffrey. "There is no such thing as a porch manager." "And yet," said Jeffrey, with the mildest possible smile, "here I am." I nearly spilled my coffee. I did not spill my coffee, but it was close. Brenda looked at the clipboard. She looked at Jeffrey. She looked at the porch. She looked at the fern. The fern that she had described in official documentation as plant materials of unclear horticultural classification, which was sitting in its little stand, luminous with health, clearly and obviously a fern, absolutely thriving, refusing to be anything other than exactly what it was. "Mr. Mercer," she said loudly, directing her voice at the house in general. I opened the front door. "Morning, Brenda. Can you explain what is happening on your porch?" "My porch?" I looked at Jeffrey, and Jeffrey looked at me with the expression of a professional who has no notes, no concerns, and an impeccable record. "It looks great, doesn't it? Jeffrey's done wonderful work this morning." "You hired someone to stand on your porch." "I hired a porch management professional," I said. "Given the HOA's concerns about the standard of my porch, I decided to take a proactive approach and bring in some expertise." Brenda's jaw moved in a way that suggested she was experiencing a range of emotions and had not yet decided which one to lead with. "The HOA guidelines don't require you to hire. There is no guideline that says—" "I know," I said. "I'm just exceeding the guidelines, going above and beyond. I really took your concerns to heart, Brenda." She looked at the clipboard. She was looking for something, anything, to cite. I watched her eyes move across the porch. The rocking chair, correctly positioned, nothing wrong with it. The fern, lush, healthy, professionally displayed. The welcome mat, centered. The ceramic planter, elegant, tasteful, absolutely above reproach. Jeffrey, standing in his tuxedo like a man who had personally invented the concept of standards. There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing to cite. "I'll be reviewing the guidelines," Brenda said finally. It was a threat, technically, but it had the energy of a retreat. "That sounds great," I said. "Can I offer you anything, Jeffrey? Do we have anything to offer?" Jeffrey, from the porch, said, "I can bring out a glass of water, sir, if you have a visitor who would like refreshment." Brenda stared at Jeffrey. Jeffrey regarded her with polite, professional neutrality. The fern gleamed. "No," said Brenda. "No. And she walked away. She walked away quite quickly, actually, for someone who normally moved through the neighborhood with the stately pace of a woman who owned the place. I watched her go. Jeffrey watched her go. We did not exchange a glance or a word until she was fully around the corner and out of sight. Then I looked at Jeffrey, and Jeffrey looked at me, and Jeffrey said with tremendous dignity, "I believe that went well, sir." "Jeffrey," I said, "that was the single greatest thing I have ever witnessed." "You're very kind." And that, dear listener, was only the beginning. The thing you have to understand about Brenda is that she is not a person who retreats. She retreats regrouped and comes back stronger. The way that certain viruses do when they encounter an antibiotic. She left my driveway that morning looking rattled, but I knew that she was already scheming. A woman who writes 3 official letters about a fern does not simply walk away from a setback. True to form, the response came within 48 hours. Not another letter this time. This time, Brenda scheduled an emergency meeting of the Maplewood Estates Community Standards Committee, and she invited me to attend. I want to be clear. The invitation was technically optional. It was framed as a courtesy notification, which in HOA language means, "We're going to discuss you whether you show up or not, but if you show up and we fine you, at least you can't say you weren't warned." I showed up. I also brought Jeffrey. The community center meeting room held about 40 chairs. 14 of them were occupied when I arrived. Brenda was at the front with her laptop and a projector, which I found concerning. Dave Kowalski was in the 3rd row, looking like a man who had been required to attend something he was not entirely comfortable being at. Margaret Chen was there, which surprised me, until she caught my eye and gave me a small, barely perceptible nod that I chose to interpret as solidarity. I took a seat in the 2nd row. Jeffrey stood behind me. He was still in his tuxedo, because Jeffrey does not appear to own other clothes, or if he does, he considers them appropriate only for the home. He stood with his hands clasped, looking around the room with the benign interest of someone attending an unusual cultural event. Brenda, to her credit, did not visibly react when Jeffrey walked in, but I noticed her grip on her laser pointer tighten. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "This is an informal community discussion about certain recent developments in the neighborhood that may require our attention." She clicked to the first slide. It was a photograph of my porch, taken from the street, clearly from the morning Jeffrey had been standing on it. In the foreground, Jeffrey, immaculate, professional, in his tuxedo. In the background, the porch, flawless, the fern, radiant. "This," said Brenda, "is Mr. Mercer's front porch." A murmur moved through the room. From the back, someone, I think it was Gary Patel from number 22, who had always struck me as a reasonable person, said, "What's wrong with it?" Brenda clicked to the next slide. It was a close-up of the fern. "This vegetation, that's a fern," said Gary. "It is a fern," Brenda confirmed, with the tone of a prosecutor reading charges. "A fern which has been present on Mr. Mercer's porch for—" "Ferns are plants," said Gary. "You can put plants on porches." The guideline specifically states, "The guideline says no dead plants or visible debris," said a woman near the back, whose name I didn't know but whom I was beginning to deeply appreciate. "A fern isn't debris." Brenda moved to the next slide, which was a close-up of Jeffrey. "The more pressing concern," she said, "is this." "Is that a butler?" said Margaret Chen, with what I would describe as delighted disbelief. "He's a porch management professional," I said helpfully. "Is that allowed?" said someone. "Is there a guideline against it?" said someone else. Brenda turned to her laptop and began scrolling through what I assumed was the 42-page guidelines document with the focus of someone looking desperately for something they had not previously thought to include. "Section 14, she said, addresses commercial activity." "He's not a commercial activity," I said. "I'm paying him privately. He's providing a personal service, like a lawn care professional." "The lawn care professionals don't wear tuxedos," said Brenda. "Mine does," I said. Jeffrey, from behind me, said nothing. He simply stood with the patient dignity of a man who has attended more difficult meetings than this one, in establishments considerably more prestigious than the Maplewood Estates Community Center. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. In the end, despite Brenda's best efforts, the committee concluded, by a vote of 9-5, that there was no specific guideline against having a professionally dressed individual present on one's porch. Brenda was permitted to submit a proposed amendment for consideration at the next quarterly meeting, which was 3 months away. Until then, Jeffrey was entirely above board. I left the meeting. Jeffrey held the door. Now, I want to acknowledge that a reasonable person, and I maintain, a reasonable person, would have stopped there. I had made my point. The porch was compliant. The HOA had no grounds. Jeffrey had performed magnificently. I could have thanked Jeffrey for his services, let the fern continue to thrive, and moved on with my life. But here is the thing about Brenda's proposed amendment. She was clearly going to pursue it. And the 3 months before the next quarterly meeting were going to be 3 months during which she would be canvassing neighbors, collecting signatures, building a case. She had the energy of someone with a mission. She had the clipboard. She had the cream-colored letterhead. So I decided to use the 3 months. I called Jeffrey the morning after the meeting. "Jeffrey," I said, "I'd like to expand the scope of our arrangement." "Of course, sir. In what direction?" "Upward," I said. "Significantly upward." Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. "I see. What level of professionalism are we aiming for?" "I want this to be the most formally managed porch in the history of American residential property," I said. "I want people to drive through this neighborhood specifically to look at this porch. I want Brenda Kowalski to have to choose between submitting a complaint about the porch and explaining to the committee, in writing, that her complaint is that the porch is too professional." There was a brief, appreciative pause. "That," said Jeffrey, "is the kind of brief I find most engaging." Over the following weeks, the porch evolved. Not in a chaotic show-off way, that would have been easy to cite. In a precise, deliberate, absolutely above-reproach way that was somehow more maddening than ostentation. Jeffrey introduced a small folding stand, polished to a high shine, on which he placed a leather-bound guest register. Anyone who wished to could sign it. This was not required, obviously. But Jeffrey offered the opportunity to every passer-by with such gracious professionalism that several of them actually signed it. Margaret Chen signed it on the 3rd day. Gary Patel signed it on the 5th. On the 8th day, I noticed that Dave Kowalski had signed it, first name only, like he was worried about evidence. The fern was joined, after a consultation with a local horticulturalist, by 2 additional plants, a beautifully maintained rosemary shrub and a compact box hedge, both chosen for their visual tidiness and their absolute conformity to any reasonable interpretation of aesthetic guidelines. The small ceramic planter that Jeffrey had introduced in week 1 was now accompanied by a matching second planter, the pair of them flanking the steps with the symmetry of something you'd see on a hotel entrance. The rocking chair had been joined, with my permission and Jeffrey's recommendation, by a small wrought iron occasional table, painted black, upon which a fresh copy of the local newspaper was placed each morning. There was a newspaper on the porch now. A fresh, neatly folded newspaper, delivered every morning, placed on the table by Jeffrey at 6:46 a.m. No guideline prohibited this. No guideline had ever imagined this would need to be prohibited. It was a newspaper on a table on a porch. It was perfectly, almost offensively normal. And yet somehow, in the context of Jeffrey standing beside it in his tuxedo, it was extraordinary. The neighborhood was, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, extremely entertained by all of this. I started getting texts from neighbors I had barely spoken to before. Gary Patel sent me a message that just said he was there at 6:47 this morning. I checked. Absolute legend. The woman from the back of the HOA meeting, whose name turned out to be Patricia and who worked as a paralegal, which explained her comfort with the guideline debate, left a note in my mailbox that said, "We're rooting for you, Logan. Also, your fern looks incredible." Brenda, meanwhile, was clearly not having a good few weeks. I would see her from time to time doing her morning survey, and she would stop at my porch with her clipboard, and Jeffrey would say, "Good morning, madam," in that perfectly calibrated voice of his. And she would look at the porch, and she would look at Jeffrey, and then she would look at the porch again, and she would write something on her clipboard that I was fairly confident was not a violation notice, but was instead pure frustration being vented in writing because she had nowhere else to put it. She tried, I heard from Dave through the HOA meeting grapevine, to locate a specific guideline she could use. She found nothing in the existing document. She tried to fast-track her proposed amendment, but the board requires 30 days' notice before any vote, and she had already used hers. She reached out to the HOA's legal contact, a property law firm in town, and asked whether having a formally dressed person on a porch constituted a violation of any kind. The response, according to Dave, who told Patricia, who told Margaret, who told me, was essentially no, and also please stop calling us about this. In week 5, something unexpected happened. It became a thing, not just a neighborhood thing, a local thing. Someone posted a photo on a community social media group. The photo was of Jeffrey, porch, fern, newspaper, full morning setup, golden early light. It got 400 likes, which for a local neighborhood group is essentially viral. The comments were spectacular. "This is the best thing in this neighborhood." "Sir, that's a porch butler. He's been there every morning for a month, I checked. The fern is so healthy, oh my God. HOA watching this in agony, I guarantee it." A local blogger who wrote about suburban life found the post and did a short piece on it. The piece was titled, "I am not making this up. One man's HOA feud has produced the most elegantly managed porch in suburbia." It included an interview with me, conducted, at my insistence, on the porch with Jeffrey standing at his post, and a photograph that I have since printed and framed. In the photograph, I am sitting in the rocking chair. Jeffrey is standing behind it. The fern is to my left. The newspaper is on the table. The rosemary is behind us, impeccably maintained. The morning light is catching the polish on Jeffrey's shoes. I look, in this photograph, like a man who has won something. Brenda, apparently, saw the article. Dave later told me that she read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, and was silent for so long that he had to check if she needed medical attention. She did not. She was simply experiencing what I imagine was the specific, unpleasant feeling of realizing that you started something that has now escaped your control entirely, and though grown into something you cannot contain, and is being appreciated by hundreds of strangers on the internet. The quarterly meeting came on a Thursday evening in October. The weather had turned cooler, which meant Jeffrey had added to the Porch ensemble a small, tasteful outdoor space heater, the kind that looks like a classical column and glows amber in the evening light, and a monogrammed porch blanket folded precisely over the arm of the rocking chair. The whole setup, honestly, looked like something out of a magazine at this point. Several neighbors had told me so, unprompted. The meeting room was, this time, full. Not 14 chairs occupied, but something closer to 35. Word had gotten out that Brenda's amendment was on the agenda, and the neighborhood had, collectively, decided to show up and see what happened. Brenda's proposed amendment read, in the version she distributed before the meeting, "No homeowner shall employ, engage, or otherwise arrange for any person to be present on their property's primary entry area, porch, stoop, or accessible outdoor space in a professional service capacity for more than 2 hours per day, with the exception of bona fide maintenance personnel engaged in active maintenance activity." It was, I had to admit, fairly well targeted. She had been to the legal firm after all, or at least had thought about this very carefully. Patricia, who had actually read it with professional eyes, told me it was creative but extremely citable in response. I came to the meeting with Jeffrey, obviously. At this point, Jeffrey attending HOA meetings was simply what we did together. He stood at the back of the room. Several people turned to look at him when he entered, and he nodded at them with the cordial grace of someone at a reception. I also came with Patricia, who had, entirely voluntarily, because she found this genuinely interesting, and also, I think, because she found Brenda genuinely exhausting, prepared a brief written response to the proposed amendment. And I came with the signatures of 19 neighboring homeowners collected by Margaret Chen over the previous 2 weeks, which stated their opposition to the proposed amendment on the grounds that it was arbitrary, unenforceable, and not in keeping with the neighborhood's stated values of community, warmth, and mutual respect, which were, delightfully, printed on the front page of the Maplewood Estates Community Standards document, right above the 42 pages of aesthetic guidelines. Brenda presented her amendment with the energy of someone who had been building to this moment for months. She cited the community's aesthetic standards. She cited the potential precedent. She said, with remarkable restraint, that she was not targeting any individual homeowner, but was acting in the interests of the community. She did not look at Jeffrey when she said this, which I thought took considerable self-discipline. I presented my response. Patricia presented the written objection. The 19 signatures were read into the record by Gary Patel, one who had volunteered to do so, and read each name with the careful diction of someone who understood they were participating in something that might one day be told as a story. There was a discussion that lasted 40 minutes. During the discussion, several things happened that I want to note for the record. 3 people said, unprompted, that my porch had, and I quote, raised the visual standard of the street. One person said that Brenda's amendment was the kind of thing that makes people not want to join the HOA. Dave Kowalski, who was technically required to be neutral as Brenda's husband, but who had clearly been silently oppressed for a long time, said that he thought the amendment as written was perhaps too broadly restrictive, and looked directly at the table when he said it. The vote was 11-8 against. The amendment failed. Brenda closed her laptop with a sound that I can only describe as controlled anguish. Jeffrey, from the back of the room, said nothing. He simply stood with his hands clasped, in his tuxedo, in a community center meeting room in the suburbs, with the equanimity of a man who had endured far stranger situations and come through them with his dignity intact. Afterward, in the parking lot, Margaret Chen came up to me and shook my hand with both of hers. "That was wonderful," she said. "Genuinely wonderful." Gary Patel gave Jeffrey a firm handshake and said, "Your work has been exemplary, sir," which Jeffrey received with a brief, pleased nod, which was the most expressive I had ever seen him. Patricia said she was going to put this on her list of favorite cases even though it was not technically a case, and she had not charged me anything. Dave Kowalski passed me on the way to his car. He stopped. He looked at me. He said very quietly, "The fern looks great," and kept walking. I think that was the best thing anyone said to me that entire night. The weeks that followed were quiet in the best possible way. Brenda did not appear at the end of my driveway anymore. The cream-colored letters stopped coming. I began to suspect, based on the complete cessation of HOA correspondence, that Brenda had perhaps redirected her considerable energy toward other violations in the neighborhood. I noticed the family on Birchwood Drive finally painted their mailbox, which had been faded for years, and I assumed this was not a coincidence. Jeffrey continued his morning shifts. I had kept the arrangement going partly because it was genuinely useful, and partly because I had become, over the course of these weeks, genuinely fond of Jeffrey, in the way you become fond of someone who helps you through a conflict with grace and never once makes it feel undignified. He had, in his tenure on my porch, dealt with 2 delivery drivers who tried to leave packages on the step without ringing the bell, one neighbor's unleashed dog who made a run for the porch steps, 4 children who asked him if he was a vampire, and 1 journalist from the local paper who showed up unannounced wanting a follow-up piece, whom Jeffrey handled with such exquisite professionalism that the journalist actually wrote in the article, "The porch manager was, frankly, better at media management than most press contacts I've dealt with." He had also, I later learned, recommended the local garden center where I should buy additional plants for the porch. He had quietly repaired a loose board on the porch steps one morning after noting it was a safety concern. He had, on one occasion when I was running late to a work call, accepted a certified mail delivery on my behalf and left it on the kitchen table with a brief, handwritten note explaining the contents and the signature receipt number. These things are not in the job description. They are, however, exactly what Jeffrey does, because Jeffrey does not understand how to do a job without doing it fully. I kept him on through November. By December, the porch had gained a pair of tasteful evergreen wreaths for the season, placed by Jeffrey on a morning when I had not asked him to do anything special, which I took as a sign that he was, in his own way, invested in this project. Biscuit, who had initially greeted Jeffrey with the frantic energy of a 12-pound dog who considers all visitors a potential threat, had by now settled into a routine of sitting on the porch beside Jeffrey each morning with the calm of someone who has accepted their life circumstances and found them adequate. The photograph of Jeffrey and Biscuit sitting on the porch together on a Tuesday morning in November, Biscuit in his little plaid sweater, Jeffrey in his tuxedo, both of them looking out at the street with identical expressions of composed watchfulness, became, when someone shared it online, somewhat more viral than the first one. One comment read, "The dog is also in a tuxedo in his mind, you can see it." Another said, "Honestly, this is the neighborhood energy I want to live in." Another said, "Brenda, I hope you see this." I don't know if Brenda saw it. I like to think she did. I like to think she was sitting at her kitchen table with her morning coffee and her clipboard, looking at a photo of my porch, my beautiful, professionally managed, fern and rosemary and wrought iron table porch, and thinking about how she had sent me a letter about a forgotten coffee mug and a 12-pound dog's water bowl, and had somehow ended up here, in this timeline, with this outcome. Because here's the thing, Brenda. Here is the thing that I think gets lost in this story if you tell it purely as a petty HOA dispute, which it is, obviously, but which is also something slightly more than that. You looked at my porch and saw a problem. You saw disorder. You saw something that didn't fit your vision of what this neighborhood should look like. And you responded to that perception with official letters on cream-colored paper and citations and amendments and committee meetings and everything in the HOA rulebook that you had decided you were entitled to deploy. But I looked at my porch and saw something that was mine. A rocking chair I chose. A mug I'd forgotten to bring in because I'd been up late finishing a project I was proud of. A plant I'd bought because I wanted something living on the porch. And a little dog's water bowl because Biscuit likes to sit with me in the mornings, and the least I can do is make sure he has water. You saw a mess. I saw a life. And I'll admit that hiring a butler in a tuxedo to guard that life was, objectively, the most disproportionate response to a letter about a fern that a person has ever deployed in the history of suburban conflict. Jeffrey himself acknowledged, in one of our quieter morning conversations, that it was, quote, a somewhat robust countermeasure. I agreed with him. I think it was perfect. Because now, Brenda, that porch is genuinely the most beautiful, best-maintained, most professionally stewarded porch on the street. Your letters didn't make my porch better. Jeffrey made my porch better. My refusal to accept that a chair and a fern were a problem made my porch better. The 19 neighbors who signed a piece of paper saying they liked my porch made my porch better. You didn't do that. I did that. Jeffrey did that. Well, Biscuit sat on it in his sweater and helped. And that fern? That fern that you put in an official letter as plant materials of unclear horticultural classification? I had it repotted in November. Bigger pot, better soil, fresh layer of decorative moss on top. Jeffrey placed it himself, adjusted the stand, stepped back, and said, "That looks very well, sir." And it does, Brenda. It looks very well. Anyway, that's the story. That is what happened. Jeffrey still comes by on Tuesday and Thursday mornings now. We scaled back from 5 days once the HOA business resolved. But he likes the routine, and honestly, so do I. Biscuit sits with him. The newspaper gets placed on the table. The fern continues to thrive. The rosemary smells incredible in the late morning when the sun hits it. Brenda has not sent a letter in 3 months. The cream-colored envelopes have not appeared. The clipboard, as far as I know, has been redirected elsewhere. The 42-page document sits somewhere in a community center filing cabinet, not having been consulted on my behalf in quite some time. And every morning, in this quiet suburb, in this neighborhood of symmetrical gardens and color-coded fences and very strongly worded aesthetic guidelines, my porch sits at the end of my driveway looking exactly like what it is. A place where someone lives, and is comfortable, and has a rocking chair and a fern and a small dog, and, twice a week, a butler in a tuxedo. A porch, in other words, that is doing exactly what it was built for. I can't think of a single thing wrong with that. Logan Mercer, resident, Maplewood Estates.